we also have a special guest, Alison Jones, who's joining us from Women's Health Loddon Mallee. So thank you. We'll keep things moving because we've got a lot to cover today in a very short space of time. If you do have any questions, in case we get to the end and we have some time, please put them in the chat. Otherwise, we will follow up and collate them into an email and send them out to you afterwards. And also just to let you know that we are recording this session, so it can be shared with you afterwards, and we'll get started. So I'd like to start today by acknowledging the traditional land on which we're all meeting today. For me, it's the Djabbarung and the Jabberjali, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present. I also acknowledge that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders have cared for this country for thousands of generations, and the longest living culture on this planet, which is something for us to all be very proud of. So acknowledging that sovereignty was never ceded, and this always was and always will be Aboriginal land.
So thanks for the introduction, Claire. So the purpose of our session today is to raise awareness of the complex and gendered impacts of disaster, and that includes the increase in family violence, and to highlight the importance of diversity in emergency planning, response and recovery. So for the session today, and yes, Claire's already mentioned it's quite short and sharp, but we will be covering why this is important to the Grampians region. We're going to have a look at what the evidence tells us and just an overview of that, of course. And then we'll hear from our guest speaker, Alison Jones from Women's Health Loddon Mallee. We'll also then highlight what actions that you can take now to reduce the gendered impacts of disaster, and of course, how Women's Health Grampians can support you in this work. Before we go any further, we do want to make sure that everybody does have a shared understanding of what we mean when we talk about gender and when we talk about disaster. So gender is a person's chosen gender, which may or may not correspond to the person's designated sex at birth. So when we refer to women, we are referring to anyone who identifies as a woman, and when we refer to a man, we refer to anyone who identifies as a man. In relation to disaster, the official definition is any hazardous event that interacts with pre-existing vulnerabilities and inequalities to disrupt the everyday function of a community or society. And this includes hazards such as bushfires, floods, earthquakes, hurricanes, cyclones, and pandemics. We will note that you'll see here that war, terrorism, and slow onset disasters like drought are excluded from the definition. So however, we certainly acknowledge that in our region, heat waves and drought, whilst not included in the definition of disaster, are extremely relevant to our region and have comparable gendered impacts and outcomes.
So why is this important for us in the Grampians region? So we live in Victoria, and Victoria is one of the 3 most fire-prone areas in the world, along with California and the Mediterranean. So we're not any strangers in this stage to bushfires, certainly, and other disasters as well. So Victoria's climate has already changed, and it's predicted, if the emissions continue to increase, that by 2050 there'll be quite significant changes to our climate. So Victoria will be hotter, 2.5 degrees roughly hotter, which will mean that we're going to get twice as many very hot days. We'll also have a much longer fire season. We've already started to see our fire season shift, so that we're getting a longer season and more into the springtime as well. So we'll get a longer fire season with up to double the number of high fire danger days. We'll also see a decrease in cool season rain, and we'll get more intense rain events when we do get the rain. So in summary, for Victoria, basically high likelihood of much more frequent fires, bushfires, and also flooding events. For us in the Grampians region, 99% of our region is considered to be at high risk of bushfire, and the climate is likely to change. So Horsham, for example, will have more of an environment like Deniliquin, and Ballarat will be more like Hamilton, which potentially some of you who live in Ballarat are not thinking that that's such a bad thing. But there are other impacts as well. So Horsham and Hindmarsh, for example, are going to be two of the most affected local government areas in Victoria due to climate change. And so that's relevant to house prices. It will shift, drying soils will have an impact on house prices and that type of thing as well. The Wimmera Southern Mallee is also going to be the third most impacted economy in the state as well. So there are other significant impacts for us in this region with climate change. But moving on specifically to disaster, how is this relevant for us and where is this relevant? So as we're going through today, have a think about your day-to-day and where this might be useful for you and some of the things to think about in your day-to-day. So for example, there are in Victoria and within the Grampians region, there are many strategies and plans that are relevant to not only climate change, but disaster specifically. There's a big focus on three key areas: mitigation, adaptation, and building resilience, and particularly community resilience. But the majority of those plans and strategies are actually gender blind. And if they do factor in gender, it's usually around transgender data in the health context, or it's talking about more vulnerable populations, so breastfeeding mothers, older women, etc. All of this is relevant in many areas. So for example, anyone here who is part of any emergency services organisation who plays a role in response and or recovery, this is obviously very relevant for that whole process. So emergency planning, response and recovery, and any of those committees that you might be involved with. It's also very relevant for health planning, thinking about things like heat waves and the gendered impacts of heat waves and pandemics. And there's research to support both of those. And we also know that recently, having gone through a pandemic, that there were very gendered impacts in that regard. Municipal health and wellbeing plans, this is very relevant, and also any sort of climate adaptation thinking in terms of strategies, plans in your organisation. So yeah, as we go through, have a think about how you could apply a gender lens to that working, because it's acknowledged internationally. Obviously, there's a very strong link between gender, climate change, and disaster, and we do see it in sort of Australian aid, internationally. But there's very little acknowledgement of that in the domestic policy context.
Thank you, Claire. So now we're going to have a look at some of the research regarding gender and disaster that's actually taken place in Victoria. And the first is from a report called The Way He Tells It, Relationships After Black Saturday by Gender and Disaster Australia, which focuses on the aftermath of the Black Saturday bushfires in 2009. This research was the first of its kind in Australia to identify and examine the link between disasters and violence against women. The findings from this research is extensive, but there's a few key points that we'd like to highlight today. So the first is that traditional gender roles are perpetuated during and after disaster. The research has shown that men are more likely to be involved in tasks that are high risk. They may be defending properties or attempting rescues. And then in the aftermath of a disaster, they're doing the physical work, clearing debris, etc. While women are more typically in the nurturing roles. They're taking care of children, of older people. They're performing the tasks such as the cooking and the cleaning and dealing with the insurance, while also providing emotional support to others around them. The different gender roles during and after disasters lead to different kinds of impacts and different risks. Restrictive ideas about masculinity can trap men into that heroic behaviour, which increases the risk to their safety and prevents healthy emotional responses to trauma. And this sometimes has violent consequences, not only for themselves, but for those around them, which leads to the next point, in that the violence against women does increase in the aftermath of disasters. The research provides evidence that family violence increased after Black Saturday, and this is consistent with international research showing violence against women increases in the aftermath of a disaster. The research provided evidence from 16 women of new or exacerbated violence linked to Black Saturday. And additional evidence followed showing that women in communities worst affected by the Black Saturday bushfires were 7 times more likely than their peers to have experienced violence. In addition to this, disaster magnifies women's reluctance to disclose or report violence. The workers at the time noted a strong tendency for women to underplay their own suffering, even withdrawing from family services if they were accessing them prior to the fires. And the report also showed that the community unfortunately excuses post-disaster violence. The report found that the community excused it because primarily they had hoped that the violence was temporary and that it would eventually resolve itself as life got back to normal. And it was also felt that it seemed to be disloyal or ungrateful to talk about the violent behaviours that some of these men were displaying. And finally, a key point we wanted to highlight from this report is that there is a stigma for men to seek help. So acknowledging that men are overwhelmingly reluctant to seek help for any personal problem, but whether that be physical or mental, the women in this report found there were significant inadequacies in the help that their partners were offered, or perhaps even worse, that they weren't offered any help at all. Now we're going to move on to another report that has been done on a disaster, and that report is, sorry, lost my place there. My apologies. Sorry, we're going to move on to the report, which is Our Community, Our Voice, Lessons from the 2022 Maribyrnong Floods by Jen West. This report is available in English and Vietnamese, and the report examines the impact of the flooding on this community with a particular focus on the impact on women and children from migrant and refugee backgrounds. From the report, there were 9 recommendations made to state and local governments to improve disaster planning, preparation, response, and recovery. The 9 recommendations focused on communication, financial security, housing, safety, family violence, children, community, climate adaptation, and implementing the Gender and Emergency Management Guidelines, commonly referred to as the GEM guidelines. We've just chosen to highlight a few of the key points from this research that you can see on your screen here that we feel are really relevant to our region. The first being that disasters compound existing inequalities in communities, and specific cohorts of people face the greatest difficulties. And these include women and children, but also older people, people who identify as LGBTIQA+, and communities from migrant and refugee backgrounds. We also want to highlight that disasters compound existing inequalities, which I've just mentioned, and that there is a great need for disaster recovery to be localised, gendered, and intersectional. And finally, that all disaster preparation, response and recovery should include specialist family violence agencies and include a specific focus on children with consideration of women and carers' roles in caring for children. So now I'd like to introduce our guest speaker, who we've mentioned is Alison Jones, and Alison is the Mental Health and Wellbeing Lead with Women's Health Loddon Mallee. So welcome, Alison, and we're really interested to hear your insights on the Women Rising Empowering Flood Recovery Report.
Thanks, Vanetta. Thanks for having me along, and greetings from Jarrah country. I live in Mount Alexander Shire, which was significantly less impacted than some of the other shires in our region, but is still very much feeling the impacts of the floods. I started working for Women's Health Loddon Mallee in 22 as a mental health lead, and then like a month later, the floods happened and they hit every local government area across the Loddon Mallee. All 10 of our LGAs were impacted, and like I said, the impacts are very much still being felt. The impacts are disruptive. For example, in Mount Alex, it's things like bush tracks, which is it doesn't feel significant, but if you use nature as a way to connect for your mental health and wellbeing, if you use nature for your transport options and for getting your kids to school, this disruption is a constant reminder of the floods. And I'm talking about bush tracks, but the amplification of that for a town where it's your doctor's surgery, your school, your sports facility, or for so many people, your home, is enormous amplification. So we were funded after the 22 floods to deliver a flood recovery project for women, which had lots of different facets, and I will share the case study once I finish speaking. I won't share it now because I don't want you to read it now, but I will share it in a moment. And we learned a huge amount through delivering our project. What we learned is that there's no universal experience of floods and what it means to be impacted, or what planning, response and recovery can look like at a community level, because every community is unique and the experiences of floods is complicated, it's nuanced and it's subjective. But we learned this from meeting with women. We met with women in focus groups, we met with women at gatherings, we met women in leadership positions and women who had become leaders by accident because of the floods. And we met them in coffee shops, op shops, where they live, and we asked them what they needed and what worked for them. And by meeting with women, building trust and working together, we were able to take a do-with approach to the activities that we then delivered instead of a do-for approach. And that was by far and away our biggest success. An example of this in Rochester was Girls' Night. Rochester was hugely impacted, and we wanted to do something around International Women's Day, and I drove out and met the community house manager, and I said I was from a women's health service, and she was so stressed out at the time. It was they were in such there was such a lot going on there, and she said, "We don't need any more tampons." And I said, she said, "I don't know how many people think of bleed in this town, but we're all good for female hygiene projects." And I'm sharing this because they'd literally been sent truckloads and with the best of intentions, but from multiple different companies. But if the person had sent them, who had sent the issue, because they didn't have anywhere to store them, there was nowhere dry in the whole town, and they didn't need them. So I asked them what they did need and what would make the most difference. And what I heard was that the women of Rochester needed a night off. They needed a few drinks and an opportunity to dress up, put down the scrubbers and relax. So we were able to fund an event with them that resulted in 250 women coming together to celebrate one another and where they live. And it was really beautiful. Women maintain a facade of being fine when they're not fine. They do that to ensure their families are prioritised and as a way of protecting themselves. So it's really important for you to be thinking about how you can support women and your broader community beyond the disaster as well as during it. At every stage of delivery, particularly in our focus groups, we have heard about the strengths and adaptability of flood-impacted women and the gendered burden of care that extends beyond the initial impact of the disaster. This includes care of families, neighbours, communities, and women all too often sacrifice their own health and well-being to ensure that the others that are around them are well supported. Floods and other natural disasters compound pre-existing barriers and stresses such as family violence. So you need to be planning for that in your emergency responses. The GADOS training that is really useful, and it will also help you consider gender when you're planning recovery activities, because you need to think about the barriers that might impact women's ability to attend a community event, like, you know, who's looking after their kids, who's looking after the care. I don't have very long, but my takeaway message is that when given the resource and support to do so, communities are the best place to lead their own recovery. They demonstrate so many strengths, including but not limited to informal support and leadership, sharing of local knowledge, and delivering community-led activities. But they cannot do this without resources. The communities that had the best outcomes had a local leader who was able to connect with the local governments and the supports and services that were around, and they were able to coordinate support on the ground. So they will absolutely be able to tell you what their community needs in that moment. Your job is to find out who that person is and identify how you're going to support them, both professionally, but also personally. They can't organise community mobilisation if they haven't got someone looking after their kids, and they shouldn't be going home after an 18-hour shift to an empty fridge. These are practical considerations that should be included in your emergency management plans. And you should always start by asking the community what they need, because they probably don't need tampons.
Thank you, Alison. That's yeah, a very beautiful yeah, and lots of great takeaway messages in there as well. And certainly that caring load speaks to what we see playing out in certainly in my community as well, post the bushfires here. So there's some thinking in terms of the recovery space and the aftermath, but some other considerations, and there's mounting research in relation to the gendered impacts of disaster, both internationally and locally, and that, you know, that we see the same things that occur again and again. So you may remember after the Lismore floods in 2020, the University of Newcastle carried out some research that found that women were subjected in the actual, I guess, relief centres to sexual violence and sexual assaults, which unfortunately resulted in pregnancies in the immediate aftermath. And obviously, the lack of triaging that separated people at emergency centres meant that women were in the same space with the perpetrators and also with, you know, people who've been committed of sexual assault. And so whilst, you know, obviously shelter was an immediate risk, the lack of triaging and thinking about it and factoring this in led to some really unwanted consequences. And then add that on top with the lack of access to pharmacies, to contraception, and certainly to abortion services, there were some really unfortunate outcomes that have now led to the revision of guidelines for evacuation centres in New South Wales, but certainly something for us to think about locally. Similarly with breastfeeding, you know, the lack of facilities and specific facilities within relief centres and emergency centres meant that after the Black Saturday fires, the Black Summer fires in 2019, 2020, there was a marked reduction in women's breast milk. So that was thought to be due to the environment that some of the mothers were placed in, the increased stress of the time, the lack of, I guess, privacy that they had, and also the lack of connection to safe and familiar spaces, and the fact that they were under the care of maternal child health nurses and they didn't necessarily have access to those appointments. So, you know, that first time and that connection between mother and baby is really important, and factoring that into disaster planning, you know, that can't stop. Having a baby can't stop. Caring for a young infant can't stop. So these are all things that we might need to think about in terms of our planning. And in terms of, you know, Vanita's already covered the Maribyrnong floods, but, you know, thinking about language barriers, thinking about how we communicate, thinking about how we connect with new community members. So, you know, COVID has seen people move around, and we do have people who've moved out to our communities from different areas. So how are we actually connecting with them? How are we helping them understand whether, you know, it's someone who's come in, whether there's language or their fluency in English is not necessarily that proficient, but how are we ensuring that they understand the risk, that they know where support services are, and, you know, which services are in control of what, and how they need to connect in with those. There's also other considerations around gendered economic impacts, and we've spoken a bit about what's called the caring load. So the fact that we see in the research that post-disaster, you know, women's paid and unpaid caring load can increase, and quite often does. You know, women tend to connect into their communities and offering support. So, you know, the checking in, the looking after children, the, you know, cooking for the people who are, you know, bringing everything together and counting the truckloads of tampons that are coming in. But, you know, that caring load increases, you know, whether it's for their immediate family or for elderly people, and that can delay their return to work or reduce the number of hours that they are working. And quite often that work is referred to as soft infrastructure. So when we're talking about community resilience, there's now an acknowledged amount of research that sees that sort of investing in the soft infrastructure and the community resilience will help communities to come back, and they will help communities to sort of create, as Alison was saying, to create and support each other in what they need and in accessing the external resources to help that to rebuild, because they are the people who know their communities the best and what they need. So that's a growing importance. So conscious of time, but the next steps, I guess, are action. So how can you take this information today and and turned into some practical actions. So consider, consider putting gender in your emergency management processes, and so that's your planning, your preparedness, your response, your relief, recovery, whether that's in your REMC, MEMC meetings, whether that's actually going through, thinking about how your setups for relief centres, actually put a gender lens over that and start and think about, what impacts there are. And that's certainly something that we can help you with if you want to. That ties in nicely to gender impact assessments, obviously. Complete a gender impact assessment for setting up your emergency relief centre, or for, your emergency management planning, etc. And then also incorporating the gender and emergency management guidelines into that process. So the Gender and Disaster Australia have got some great resources. We'll send those out at the end, but they're really good to start and use, and you can start and use those today. You can also consider doing the Lessons in Disaster training, which is Gender and Disaster Australia's training. Women's Health Grampians has accredited trainers, so we can provide that training for you. It's free, and it can be relevant, obviously, to people working in emergency management, community health services, local government, the health sector, community groups. It's a really good deeper dive into a lot of what we've been talking about today. And then importantly, seek out and engage with diverse voices in your community, and make an effort to connect in, so that you understand their needs and that you understand, where they are, how they receive information, etc. Make a concerted effort to do that. Think about who are on your planning groups and your community groups. And if you're in recovery now as well, think about how this applies to what you're seeing on the ground and the needs of the communities that you're directly involved with. And as I mentioned before, we are here to support you with that. So if you, have any direct questions, you want us to reach out, please put your contact details in the chat, or contact your CoRE consultants as well.
Thanks, Claire. So obviously today we have referenced quite a number of resources, and Alison has kindly put some links in the chat already, but we'll also be emailing you links to all the resources that you can see on your screen there. To anyone who's registered to attend today, you'll receive that via email. And as Claire just mentioned, if you have any specific questions, or if you'd like to speak with us directly about anything that we've covered today, please pop your details in the chat and we'll be sure to follow up with you. The next thing we want to talk to you about is a reminder about our CoRE Friends Network. So if you aren't already a member of the CoRE Friends Network, we really do encourage you to join that, and you can do that by scanning the QR code on the screen, and this way that you can keep up to date with everything that's happening at Women's Health Grampians in this evolving space, and also it will help you play your part in creating a safe and respectful community. Over to you, Claire.
Thank you, everyone, and wow, we made it on time.
We did.
As I said, thank you so much for joining us, and really we've literally just scratched the surface very quickly today. There's an awful lot more that we could talk about. We hope it's been useful, and if you do want further information, please get in touch with us. Like I said before, we're here to support you. This is a new and emerging area for a lot of people, and there's a lot of research out there that we can pull together to support you, and there's the Lessons in Disaster training. Thank you again to Alison for sharing your lived experience, and yeah, enjoy the rest of your days.